7, verses 6 to 15. We shortened it to 15. Again, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 6 to 15. There's pews in the Bible if you want to follow along. It's also up on the screen. Starting from verse 6. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I am myself, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with them, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. This is the word of the Lord.
Let's pray. Father, the most difficult thing about the life that I'm living right now and everyone here at Harvest is living right now is to be content, is to trust that you've called us to where we're at. We believe and suppose, and maybe we're told that there's a better life in the future, maybe away from a spouse or maybe with a future spouse. And it's so hard to find joy today in what you've called us to. So, Father, as we search your word, and as Paul reminds us that where we are right now is a gift, may our hearts open to that truth. May we be willing not to search for the next thing, but enjoy whatever is in front of us, whoever is in front of us. But most importantly, may we enjoy you. In the name of your Son, amen. Morning, Harvest and visitors. If I haven't mentioned it yet, my name's Kevin McGill, lead pastor, serve alongside of the elders and deacons, and we have the weekly joy of bringing worship and the word to you. And as you guys know, we're doing a short 3-part series regarding marriage. We will address some other things too, but regarding marriage, it's called The Good, the Bad, and the Holy. And last week we talked about the mission of marriage. And I described to you why God brings us together. That is, it is not just so that we have someone else to kind of fill the space and time with, but that God calls us on a mission. And I also mentioned to you guys that there is a reason that God wants for man to be married to woman, and it's that even though relationship with God is important, God points out that it's not good for man to be alone. If you guys remember, Jenny had been gone all week, and I was alone, and the proof was the beard. The beard was a sign of my loneliness. Now, some of you guys pulled me aside afterwards and said, well, Jenny's coming. Jenny came back. What does she think of the beard? Guys, can I tell you today? She loves the beard. So this beard has gone on a journey from loneliness to love. And a little skin rash too, but love. She loves the beard. So guys, the beard's staying. Malachi doesn't like the beard though. He really is upset by it, but who cares? Just my kid, just my son. All right, so 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 6. What the Apostle Paul wants us to understand right away, is that the life stage that you're in today is a gift. Married, single, and guess what? He will even say divorce. That the life stage that you find yourself in is a good thing. But here's the thing, because, like all of us, we all have our preferences. Paul will say, yes, every stage is good. But here in verse 6, he says, now as a concession, not as a command, I say this, I wish that all were as I myself am. What was he? He was single. So he says, yeah, they're all good. But man, I love singlehood. I like the place I'm in. And that's actually not only is that brave, but that's surprising, because when was the last time you met a single person who believed that they were completely sufficient with themselves? When was the last time you met a married person who didn't every once in a while pine for the days when they were single and their life was free? When was the last time you met an empty nester who didn't every once in a while wish their children could come back or at least be around more? So the Apostle Paul right away says, even though all remaining equal, I actually like singlehood. So what the Apostle Paul does is he demonstrates by his own life, I found the gift of singlehood. I have found the gift of the life stage that I'm in. But then he turns back to the rest of the different options. And he says in verse 7b, he says, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. And what he's going to do now for the next couple of verses is he's going to go right down the list. He's going to say, look, there's the gift of singlehood, there's the gift of marriage, and there is, surprisingly, the gift of divorce. So let's go to verse 8. And it says, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Since this is Paul's choice, you're going to hear the most about it. Like, this is the one he likes, so he's going to talk about it the most. So we have all heard the term happily married. But does anyone ever say happily single? By the time you get to your 30s and 40s or 50s and you're still single, then let's be honest, you feel like you're malformed or socially inept, maybe not even marriage material, and it doesn't help when people approach you and they try to fix you, right? They try to hook you up. They have someone for you, because clearly you cannot be happy with the life that you're living right now. But it's not just the external pressures, it's the internal pressures. Because when you're single and you're alone, it is easy to believe that the loneliness that I'm feeling right now can best be met with a spouse. See, when you're single and financially insecure, it's easy to believe that what the answer to that is a spouse. A spouse can bring in their money, their funds, and their resources. We can combine what we have and do this together. When you're single and you don't know who you are, like there's a confusion of identity. If I could just bring someone else in my life to tell me who I am, this would fix everything. But as Bill Flanagan reminds us, singleness is not a disease to which marriage is the only cure. Singleness is a gift. Christopher Wan reminds us, first, singleness is who we are at birth. Think about this, guys. It's who we are at birth and will be our destiny. And some people are called to celibacy, but everyone was single at birth, is single through their childhood and young adult years, and in the end will be single in heaven. So this is actually the reality. Singlehood is our reality, though marriage is a part of our life here on earth for some of us. So now the Apostle Paul recognizes that in any relationship, but the Apostle Paul will argue that singleness is better because it greatly reduces our anxiety. So we're going to jump around a little bit because the Apostle Paul does. And as we jump down to verse 32. It says, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. So he recognizes that in any relationship, our desire is to please the other. But when you're in a marital relationship where your desire is to please the other person, it comes with its own anxieties, okay? So maybe early on, you as a couple are just convinced, yes, we can take care of one another, we can support one another, we can be there for one another. But what happens when your spouse has a mental health crisis? And you realize, maybe actually I don't have the strength or the resources to help them. Or maybe in your mind, you're spending most of your day trying to figure out, how can I get the medical care they need to get through this next mental health crisis? And so with that comes what? Anxieties. Or what if your spouse begins to drift away, has lost interest in the relationship? So you spend all this time trying to draw them back in. You execute all of these strategies to try to get your spouse to love you once again as they used to. But what if your spouse doesn't get along with your child? And so you feel like you're always trying to reconcile the relationship between spouse and child. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to please them, and you're trying to draw them back to you. You're trying to help them. You're trying to financially support them in any way. And there's always this anxiety and always this fear and always this worry that you cannot please them. And the Apostle Paul says, here is the gift of singlehood. You don't have to spend your time trying to please your spouse because you don't have a spouse. You can spend your time pleasing God. And here's the beautiful thing about the gospel. What does the gospel tell us? You always have to remember what the gospel says. The gospel says that God is always pleased with you. So you're going to spend your life devoted to God, pleasing him. He's already happy with you. Unlike a spouse, from time to time, they're not so happy with you. Your heavenly Father loves you. You see, when Jesus died and rose again, he took his very righteousness, his very person, and put it on you. And so when God looks at you, he sees his son, and in his son, he is well pleased. And so when he looks at you, he is well pleased. So even a life of devotion to God is not this ongoing pursuit of trying to make him happy, because God is happy. Right? You don't need to feed God. You don't need to financially provide for God. God doesn't feel lonely. He doesn't need you around to feel loved and cared for. And anytime that God actually asks you to serve, because he does ask us to serve him, he actually asks us to serve his children, this planet, this earth, the poor, and the marginalized. So it's not even him. It's everyone else here on this planet, our neighbors. So singlehood, the anxiety melts away because you're not spending your day trying to please someone or help someone, but know that you fall short, because in the pursuit of pleasing God, he accepts every gift that we give to him. So that is the gift of singleness. But Paul does make a concession in verse 9, all right? He says, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, if you read through the text with me, you might be kind of disgusted a little bit over Paul's simplistic view of sexuality, as if the only motivation for marriage is sex. All right? That seems to really reduce what the marriage mission is, as we saw in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. But what we have to understand, what Paul is saying when he's saying burning with passion, he's not merely just talking about the biological urge as we understand it. See, we have to remember that we are 21st century people reading the first century text. See, in the first century and before then, anytime there was a conversation about sex and the sexual desire between a man and a woman, it was almost always understood in the context of family. See, intrinsically, whether they had read Genesis 1 or 2, they got the marriage mission. The marriage mission is that for every family to flourish and reproduce, you needed food, you needed shelter, and of course you needed sexual reproduction as part of the flourishing of the human family. So he's saying, look, if you have this sexual desire and you're attracted to someone and you're burning with passion, but not merely just for the act of sex, but to start and to raise a family, yes, go for it. There's God's grace. You see, for the 21st century, when we think of sex, we often relate it to identity. It's who I am. But not then. It wasn't necessarily an identity, a label for me, my sexual preference. Back then, who you were in terms of your sexual relationship with the opposite sex was about family, bringing and the flourishing of family here on earth. So even in this concession is much more about joining up in the marriage mission, as we talked about. So we come to the gift of marriage. So we talk about the gifts of singleness, we come to the gift of marriage. In verse 10, to the married I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. There's a lot to be said about the gift of marriage, and I'm not dismissing it whatsoever in the next few minutes. Here's the thing. We talked about the gift of marriage last week. We're going to talk about it again this week. So we're actually not going to drill down on it today, but other than to say that marriage is a gift, because we are all banding together as spouses to raise families, to fill the earth, and to bring the very glory and the imago Dei, the image of God, to this earth through our marriage relationship. So now I'm going to go to the harder one, the gift of divorce. How can divorce be a gift? He says, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, if the brother or sister is not enslaved, God has called you to peace. So it is really hard to wrap our minds around this idea that, yes, we can see that he starts off this section saying, hey, every life stage this year, it is a gift. Yes, marriage, yes, maybe even widowhood, yes, maybe even singleness. But how, Paul, can we say divorce is a gift? Well, the first thing we have to recognize is that Paul doesn't believe that going through divorce is a good thing. He explicitly says not to seek a divorce. In verse 10, he says, I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from the husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. God says in Malachi 2:16, for I hate divorce. And we know in Matthew 5:31 through 32, Jesus says the only reason two people should divorce is out of infidelity. So clearly the biblical testimony is that divorce is bad. So how does Paul then come around and say that divorce is a gift? Well, apparently this is what was happening in the church in Corinth, and it was actually one of the reasons that Paul is writing this chapter. See, what you have is this, scholars believe there was this Christian woman married to this man, and that they were both pagans, but in this relationship, she found Jesus, okay? But her husband didn't. Suddenly her life's priorities were changed upside down. She learns about this Savior who was here before, died and rose again, and is going to be coming back, and he's coming back to bring his kingdom. There will be a new heavens and a new earth. And her entire life's priorities had fundamentally changed, and she was supposed to spend her life loving her neighbor and giving to the poor and spreading the gospel, unlike her husband. So what's the natural response at that moment? Well, I'm going one way, and my husband's going another way. We should separate. We should get a divorce. But that's not quite what Paul is saying here. We'll come back to that a little bit, to that illustration about the Christian woman a little bit later. What Paul is saying here is you don't seek a divorce, but if someone walks away from the marital relationship, if that non-believing spouse walks away from the relationship with you, let them go, because now God has called you, and it says here, God has called you to peace. So what does that mean? It's not that divorce is good, and it should never be sought, because it brings real division and brokenness in the heart of any person. But when that non-believing spouse walks out of that relationship, they take all the conflict and all the separate lifestyle away from them, and you now are entering into this season of peace. This is the life stage you're in, and he's saying this life stage right now is peace for you. Embrace this time. And I think this is grace. I think this is grace, and I think this is just general wisdom for anyone who's going through a divorce. As I've said to you guys, in my life, my parents on both sides got divorced a number of times. And what I saw time and time again is between the first marriage and the second marriage and the third marriage, instead of spending that time in reflection and peace and getting to know yourself and getting to know God, it was a time of shame and anger. They just got into this shame and anger spiral. And when you're in the middle of that shame and anger spiral post-divorce, what do you believe the solution is? Go get married again, because that will fix it. And Apostle Paul says, the life stage you're in right now is a gift. Embrace it. Use this time to know who you are and to know who God is. Take every day as a gift of peace. So the gift of marriage, singleness, divorce, it's a nice idea, but have you ever met someone who said that the life stage that they're in is a gift? I mean, truly a gift. If someone declares, I'm happily married, you're a little cynical. Like, no, you can't be happily married. And if someone says, I'm happily single, you don't buy that. And if someone says, I'm happily divorced, that sounds cynical, gross, and kind of almost unchristian. How can you be happily divorced? We believe that most people, when they receive the gift of whatever stage that they're in, don't enjoy it, don't want it, and are deeply dissatisfied. We see this most, and I would argue, or see this clearest, in singlehood. In a recent book, Christina Hitchcock writes, a journalist named Kate Bollock wrote an article for the Atlantic magazine looking at attitudes toward single women like her. She had noted that many single women still long for marriage and have a fear of lifelong singleness. She says that she experienced panicked exhaustion around the age of 36. She was 39 at the time of the article. She felt an intense need to marry immediately, even if it meant settling for a less than desirable or qualified man. She interviewed several single women in their early 20s. When she asked them if they wanted to get married, and if so, at what age, they all answered yes, and that they wanted to be married by the age of 27 or 28. She reminded them of her own age, 39, and suggested that they could still be single at that age. She asked, does that freak you out? And she reports, again, they nodded. Then one of the young women with undisguised alarm whispered, I don't think I can bear doing this for that long. I don't think I can bear doing this for that long. So yes, singleness, marriage, and even divorce is a gift. But how do we get there? Because that's not our natural inclination. So the remainder of the chapter, the Apostle Paul gives us two tools that help us fully accept the life stage that we're in. One, accept the call of the life stage. And two, and this is so hard, stay. Stay. The Apostle Paul hammers over and over again, as we see in verses 25 through 31, he'll use the word call 10 times. I'm sorry, and verses 17 to 24. He'll use the word call 10 times, and then verses 25 to 31, he'll say remain, 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 stay. So the call to marriage. How do we accept the call and how do we stay? Verse 27a. Apostle Paul says, are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. The truth is we're incredibly restless. right? The grass always looks greener on the other side. Every life stage that we're in, and we think that it could be better when we are a child. We think, man, I am dependent upon my parents. They tell me how to live my life. I want to be independent. But then when we become a single young adult, we don't like the independence, and we want to become interdependent with a potential spouse. But then when we get that spouse, then we realize someone depends on me and I depend on them, and you're tired of the interdependent relationship, and you miss the glory days when you were dependent. Someone fed you and paid your bills, or where you were free. And then in your elder years, you look back and you look at the life that you lived and said, man, I wish I at least had strength to live the life that God has given me. So we're rarely satisfied in the life stage that we're in. You know what makes it worse? A life-changing event. So if you're in this life stage, wherever you're at, and then something completely changes you, then you have this kind of feeling like, well, I'm single, I need to change my life and go do something, or I'm married, but I have this great life-changing event, and I need to do that. And remember earlier when I said to you guys that this married woman, she was married to this non-believing spouse, suddenly Jesus comes back and he's paradigm shifting, and there's just this sense like I need to completely overhaul my life. Why? Because I'm no longer compatible with this person. They no longer fit with who I am. But here's just a little wisdom when it comes to compatibility, especially for those who are dating or about to get married, or maybe their first year or 2 years into marriage. The truth is, you are probably not compatible in the first place. You're not as compatible as you thought you were. See, usually when we're dating, so usually someone at college or maybe in the workplace or whatever, you have this shared lived experience, right? You're eating the same food every day at the cafeteria. You have the same professors. You're going to the same school, or maybe you work at the same office place. So it just feels like your life is one, and that this life works out together. But the truth is, over time, things begin to change. First thing, when you have children, you realize you're not as compatible as you thought, right? I mean, when we brought Malachi home, it was this beautiful moment, and it really was a very bonding experience. And yet, when we brought a child into our lives, it became very apparent to us that Jenny had a different child-rearing experience than I did. Different priorities, different ways of raising a child. So now you have this first moment of, oh, maybe we're not as compatible as we thought we were. And what happens when you get a job at this office complex and this person gets a job at this school or as a physical therapist? Then they begin to spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day having a different lived experience than you do. And you come back together and you're no longer swapping stories about the professors that you both took or the cafeteria food that you just ate that day. You're suddenly living two very different lives. And so what I would say to you guys is, compatibility is part of a conversation as we're dating, engaged, and getting married. It is a good conversation to have. It cannot be all of it, because you will change over time. Count on it. What the Apostle Paul is telling us is we are not called to compatibility, we are called to stay. We are called to stay. Let me tell you something, when you finally embrace that like, okay, I am in this marriage, of course, out of love and how we just sense that God wants us to be together, but I have decided to stay no matter what, then you discover the gift of marriage. People might assume that two individuals who've decided to stick it out through thick and thin will become lazy. Right? The marriage will turn into a prison where no one ever changes. It's the threat of divorce that'll wake them up. If you don't change, I'm walking out. Instead of saying, I'm going to stay and I'm going to commit. Well, I'm going to tell you guys, that's absolutely incorrect. All the threat of divorce will do is encourage short bursts of performance. A relationship built on divorce-driven performance is the prison. It's the prison. Only the grace-filled presence of a committed spouse can change another. And that's what Paul was talking about in verse 14, when it says the unbelieving husband is made holy by his committed wife and vice versa. What that means is that when a spouse is loved by another spouse through the unique call to stay, the struggling spouse becomes tenderhearted. If the struggling spouse is suffering through disease and mental illness and loss of a child and loss of work and whatever it is, and looks up and sees that that other person has stayed no matter what, that's when they become tenderhearted. That's when they experience grace. And guess what? That's when the two come together as one. But a quick caveat. I do see the argument where, hey, if these two people say, well, I'm never going to divorce, I do see the argument that they can become lazy. And so let's just remember that the call to stay is not a call to become apathetic and withdraw from the relationship. It is a work. It is a commitment to each other. And the call to singlehood, verse 27b, are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Once again, Paul wants the single or widow to stay right where they are. But what is the benefit of staying? He says in verse 35, to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So, single person, you can spend your time seeking your spouse, or you can spend your time devoted to God. Do you want to spend your time seeking your future spouse, or do you want to spend your time devoted to God? Should we take a quick poll? No. Okay, let's not do that. I doubt there's any single person today who would say, I want to spend my time devoted to God. It is my natural inclination and desire to find someone. That is natural, and the Apostle Paul gives grace to that. This is where he will argue against the problem of seeking a spouse, or the problem of those who desire a spouse. It's the word seeking. Seeking. You see what happens, and actually let me read this article, New York Times article titled, A Decade of Fruitless Searching, the Toll of Dating App Burnout Reports. 28-year-old Abby has been on dating apps for 8 years, bouncing between OkCupid, Bumble, Tinder, eHarmony, Match, Woo Plus, Coffee Meets Bagel. What is this? I don't know what this is. And Hinge. A committed user, she can easily spend 2 or more hours a day piling up matches, messaging back and forth and planning dates with men who seem promising. But really, she is just over it all. The swiping, the monotonous getting to know you conversations, and the self-doubt that creeps in when one of her matches fizzles. Now, the single long-term relationship has blossomed from her efforts. Other aspects of the experience weigh on her as well. Abby said she has regularly felt pressure to have sex with others. She feels compelled to keep scrolling, driven by a mix of optimism and the fear that if she logs off, she'll miss her shot at meeting someone amazing. Quote, I just feel burned out, unquote, said Abby, who's contemplating spending $4,500 to work with a matchmaker. It really is almost like a part-time job. So my personal experience has been that seeking got me farther and farther away from the one I was supposed to be with because I was blinded by my own misplaced need to find the one. You see, to seek requires you to spend most of your mental energy obsessing and critiquing over another person's worth. You know, like some of the conversations, like they might be a 6 in the looks department, but they have a really good job, so that bumps them up to a 9, right? That's the conversation you have to have. But here's one of the problems, even in that conversation. But when you obsess about the value of someone else, you eventually have to think about your own. Maybe you're only a 7 to their 9 in your mind. And you start to change yourself to fit the profile of a person that, by the way, probably doesn't even exist. But most of all, to always seek for the perfect person means you don't know how to stay where you are. The New York article goes on to say, when you're consistently disappointed by a space that was sold to you as a path to love over and over again, for many of us, for years at a time, you never really stop to ask yourself, What is this doing to my mental health? What is this doing to my well-being? Miss Silver said. Imagine anticipating receiving something good for years, existing in the state of any day now for an extremely extended period of time is incredibly unhealthy. But for those who devote themselves to God, here's the beautiful thing. You can start living your life today. Today. See, if you're spending most of your time seeking for the perfect person because you want to leave the life stage that you're in, then you'll always be on the hunt, and you'll always be looking for someone that honestly you probably will never find. Or you can turn to a God who is present, ready, and available right now. The article went on to say that she actually shut down all of her matchmaking accounts and decided to live differently, and her mental health was transformed because she wasn't always out there looking for Mr. Right. What if, singles, what if you just spent, doesn't have to be the rest of your life, but what if you just took on the challenge for the next couple of months, the rest of the summer, or maybe through to the new year? You said, I'm going to stop searching for Mr. or Mrs. Right, therefore having to change who I am to meet their particular needs or expectations. I stopped doing that, and I turned my attention to God, who accepts me right here, right now. So I don't have to go very far to find who's present, willing, and available today. What if your days and your weeks are not in thumbing and scrolling through the next dating app, but just centering your mind on a person that has loved you from before time began and has loved you so much and has sacrificed everything for you? What if that was your lived reality? What if that was your world? When you come to that place, you fully understand the gift of singleness. This time I'd like to invite the worship team forward as I pray. Father, it's just so hard to be happy where we're at. Ecclesiastes reminds us, and Jesus reminds us. It's so hard to know the good that's in front of us right now, that you're right there. Lord, make yourself known to every person in this church this week. Show us that we don't have to hunt and look for the next and better life stage, or look back, missing the days that have passed. Show us the beauty of today, of you, of your people, of the friends that we already have, of the relationships that are already near us. Teach us to rest in who you are and what you've given to us today. Help us to stay right here. In the name of your Son.